Hello, and welcome to the Community IT Innovators Technology Topics Podcast, where we discuss nonprofit technology, cybersecurity, tech project implementation, strategic planning, and nonprofit IT careers. Find us at communityit.com. Thank you for joining this Community IT Podcast Part 2. You can find Part 1 in your podcast feed if you subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.
So welcome to the Community IT Innovators webinar. Today we're going to be talking about single sign-on, or SSO. My name is Carolyn Woodard. I'm the Outreach Director for Community IT. I'm the moderator today.
And my name's Steve Longenecker. I'm the Director of IT Consulting at Community IT.
Hi, I'm Phil Oswald Christano, and I have been with Community IT for more than 24 years. And I am one of the senior project engineers.
We're going to get into this section now, which is about implementation. Steve, I think you were going to talk a little bit more about apps.
Yeah. So, all right, we've already blown the big story, which is that every app is different. And so when you're doing an SSO implementation, you get your list of apps, you go through them. Some apps require special licensing for SSO. We'll pick on Slack again. The Slack is one of our audience, of course, cares about the fact that Slack has a TechSoup available license, which is really a great pricing for nonprofits. But wouldn't you know it, if you want to use SSO with that Slack, you need to upgrade that license because now I find that I continue to find it crazy that SSO isn't kind of a baseline part of an application. At the same time, I'm sympathetic to particularly small applications that are just doing their best to deliver the functionality that makes their application competitive in a marketplace that's, tough, and they always have to keep getting rid of bugs and delivering new features and everything else. And to suddenly have to also add single sign-on functionality on top of that, it's almost always on all these applications roadmaps, but I can see why that might not be the first thing that they're doing in terms of where they're investing their development dollars. So not all apps even support it. And then if they do support it, and someone referenced this in one of the open questions, Aziz said, that they put off a big implementation of SSO because the apps that they wanted to do SSO with weren't supporting the automatic user provisioning and deprovisioning. And that was a big reason for even doing SSO in the first place. And I get that. So looking into all of these things are things that you need to do sort of ahead of the implementation. It's going to be hard to know everything from the planning stage, but you can at least get a handle on, does the application even support it? What protocol does it uses? Look and see whether there's a nice knowledge base article that's understandable about how to implement the SSO. This would normally be published on the application side, right? So if you're implementing it for Salesforce, you should be able to go to Salesforce's knowledge base and do a search for SSO, and you should be able to find, hopefully, articles that tell you how to do SSO. Really big apps with a lot of development dollars and support dollars might have specific instructions for Okta versus Entra ID versus Google. Other applications are just going to have very general instructions about SSO in general, and they're going to count on you as the implementer to be able to sort of translate that to the specific IDP that you're using. And some won't have any knowledge base article at all. And then you're like, okay, this is not a good sign. And it's not, but it doesn't mean that it can't be done, but it's a steeper hill for sure.
So I feel like maybe for the people on this webinar who are, IT managers, unfortunately, there is no, just switch that you can turn on. You do have to look into every app. So you need that list of your apps. You need to know if they support it, if they need a special license, what the ins and outs are for each one. Unfortunately, you are a non-tech person and you are thinking about this would be a great question for your MSP, your outsourced provider, or your tech, department at your organization to ask them about.
Right. And there's different things that you want to evaluate, right? Like an application that's used by everybody in the organization has bigger bang for your buck in terms of SSO than one that's just used by two people. If it's just used by two people, maybe it's not worth doing at all. Or It also depends on like the risk associated with it in terms of like, well, what happens if it is breached? You know, like, oh shoot, someone got into our New York Times subscription and they're reading the New York Times for free. Low risk, like not a big impact to your organization. You might prefer not to have that account compromised, but it's not the end of the world. They rearranged, you know, what your favorite section was. Now it's sports is at the top of the list. It shouldn't be, you know, but that's like that's it. Whereas if someone can break into your HR system, it's you know, game over, or finance, you know. So maybe those really need to be in SSO, where you've got that logging and that control point and all the things that we talked about before. So there's different things that you're considering as you're mapping out which app, because you might not get all your applications. You probably won't get all your applications, and which ones you do get and prioritize are going to be varying according to those considerations.
And that's a good reminder that the context of SSO implementation is really security, right? So even when there is a challenge such as you know, what Aziz is talking about, where you have to upgrade license, it's important to bring it up the chain to help people understand in the organization that the context is security. So yes, it might be an additional investment that we need to put in, but if it reduces the security risk, it's worth it. It might need to wait until the next fiscal year, maybe, so that it can be put in the budget. But I would not just drop it completely simply because you have to upgrade the license.
Steve, I think, can you kind of go over this slide a little bit quickly?
Yes, and it actually fits. It does fit in with a couple points that people have made. And these are two other additional considerations in terms of your application evaluation. So shared user accounts, I just mentioned the New York Times subscription. So, you know, not famously, it's not stereotypically perhaps, you know, 6 people in the organization are in the communications department or the programs department all need to like read the New York Times to just look for references to their area that they're programmatically following or whatever. And you don't want to buy 6 accounts. So you buy 1 account and then share the username and password among your 6 staffers. That's the New York Times would frown upon that. But it also doesn't work with SSO, right? Because you can't have those 6 people. There's no one to many or many to one setup for the most part with SSO. So that's just not going to work. We would probably tell you to buy more subscriptions, since that's probably the right thing to do. Anyway, no more to be said about that. The other one that's a trouble spot. So let's say that you have a finance system, and that there's a consultant who does some accounting work for you, who doesn't have a login with your IDP, right? Because they don't need one, and as long as they're like logging into the finance system with their username and password that you've given them in the finance system, that's good enough. With single sign-on, it depends on the application. Some applications allow you to use single sign-on and the regular username and password, and some say nope. Once you've turned on single sign-on, you have to use single sign-on. In which case, you either can't do it for that person, or you need to give that consultant a user account in your IDP. It's just the way. There's just certain constraints that you get into with this, and there's it's hard to do. And
with that, this is also where, you know, it matters which IDP you're using, because as a nonprofit organization, Microsoft 365, you're free to keep on creating accounts, because what matters is what license you apply. But in Okta, just to create an account, you need the license. So another challenge with SSO implementation is, again, each application, you know, behave very differently. So for example, with Slack, when SSO is configured and enabled, then the user, all the users basically have to do the binding between an existing account with the IDP. And this is something that cannot be done by the administrator. So basically, when it is enabled, Slack will send out an email, automatic email to all the users, giving them instruction on how to bind it. With LastPass, for example, if you use that and you configure it for SSO, the user will have to re-encrypt their fault. So again, it requires the user to actually do some work to make
Just
it
a little click or two. It's not that big a deal, but it's like can be confusing. It just adds to your change management burden.
But as we all know, though, with anything change management, sometimes people just completely ignore those email, and then suddenly, hey, it's not working, right? So, and also some will require federation, like with the Adobe. Now, change management in the SSO implementation is really important. It needs a lot of communication because, first of all, people will have to do things slightly differently, than the usual, and usually that alone just causes issue. um, and like what you said earlier, planning is very important. Getting the buy-in from management, from or giving education to the users. It's very important, why we're doing what we're doing. And as far as strategy, because each app has different impact, different change management, it's always good to start with the lower stakes. So applications that are being used maybe like once a month, those are a good one to change first. Application that rarely used or only a small group of people are using, those are a good low-hanging fruit. However, application like Zoom, for example, where people are using it all the time, you really have to time it and plan it correctly to make sure it goes smoothly and there's no interruption. And of course, we need to ask people to be flexible during this transition, because it's not unusual that we do a configuration, we turn it on after testing it, and something's still not quite right, and we have to roll it back, and nothing is perfect. So and also in regard to planning, it's important to know that even though, like what Steve was saying, the application may have documentation and the IDP may have documentation, in my experience, they're not always updated. Sometimes the documentation are outdated, or a smaller company is bought by a larger company. Now the name changed and all the formatting suddenly changed. It can be a nightmare in that way. So the planning is really important in order to successfully implement SSO.
All true, but I think we made it too scary. We've done this a bunch of times. And once it's done, I think the users really like it. Like, it is super convenient to just have one thing that they have to authenticate once and then sort of into everything at once. And if you do start with that lower stake stuff, logging into your benefits site, which you only have to do when you want to check your IRA account or something like that. It's like not mission critical. It's not happening all the time. Start with that stuff. Go slow, build up people's familiarity and like experience with SSO. Then you hit the hard ones, the big ones, the ones that are, but people will have familiarity with the process at that point. They're used to the communication. They've already logged into the IDP a bunch. They know how to find the app dashboard, and you sort of gain some momentum doing it that way. And it's gone really well at a number of most of our projects, and it's been fun. And while there's always been an app or two that like makes you grind your teeth, a lot of the apps are actually quite smooth and it's no big deal. And it's over and done with. Phil's done 3 or 4 app transitions at a time sometimes, right? Like,
yeah.
And then it's not that big a deal. So
Well, I will put that plug in. We do have some expertise in this. When I was saying before, if you are not the technical person, finding somebody that you trust and can talk to about it makes sense. We have a great question in the Q&A. For small organizations already using a password manager, is SSO worth the effort? If some important apps aren't going to support SSO, you'd still have to use the password manager anyway for those. So especially small organizations, can you guys talk a little bit about kind of the security versus convenience trade-off there? And being able to manage it, right? Like this is an IT
Yeah.
item that you have to be you have to have the capacity to manage.
Yeah.
So I will start with the second part of the question. What happened with applications that do not support SSO? So Okta, for example, has what's called SWA, Secure Web Application, where it basically Okta will act as your password manager, and in fact, you can set it up so that individuals can configure each application themselves for that, or it can be an application where the login is actually shared among a group of people. So there is a workaround. Microsoft has something similar. It works slightly differently, but essentially they can become the password manager. Google's implementation is a little bit differently because Google wants Chrome browser to be, the password manager. So in a way, that's built in there. But to answer the first question, we need to remember that, again, password manager is still different than SSO, right? Because the level of security gain that you get out of SSO is much more than just simply using password manager. Yeah, I don't know, Steve, if you have any.
No, I everything you're saying is true, and I don't want to like enable Tristan to take undue risks with his organization. I will say that a password manager is a lot better than no password manager, and it is a big lift for small organizations to do SSO. And I do believe that SSO is a maturing. We've seen improvements, just in the last few years. It's maturing. So I think putting it down the list of priorities is probably going to be okay for a small organization that doesn't have has other things that they need to take care of. But but Phil's point is still completely right, that it's not the same. They are not equivalent, and we shouldn't think of them as equivalent.
Yeah, and
but
also,
sometimes you just can't do it. It's like too much.
Right. But also keep in mind that if you're already using either Google for your email or Microsoft 365 as your platform, you already have the IDP, right? You have already half of what you need to set this up. So I would still consider it. Yeah.
I wanted to go back over our learning objectives, which we hope that everyone feels. You have learned about single sign-on, what it is, what it entails. You can understand the value of it to your organization. And I think we just got into some of the questions of we didn't even talk about costs, right? But you have to trade off that. What are your risks? Do you have some apps that are more risky than others? Do you have the capacity to, to do SSO on your end? And of course, as you said, password manager is better than no password manager. So making sure that you have some training and people who are conscious of security in everything that they're doing, whether or not you have single sign-on in there. We learned some of the mechanics of how it works. Of course, we can only scratch the surface, but I hope that people feel like you could understand what we're talking about. If you have more questions, please get in touch with us. We love to talk about this sort of thing. And then we touched at the end on a lot of those considerations in the change management. Thank you, Phil, for sharing that with us and just making sure you're communicating and telling people why and practicing on the smaller apps and then doing the Zoom or the the apps that people are using every day, that if they can't log in, they're going to freak out. I want to go really quickly to just let you know that next month, I'm going to be talking with our CEO, Johan Hammerström, and our Director of Information Systems and Technology, Pat Sprahe, about a common fear in nonprofit technology, the fear of missing out, or FOMO. So we're going to talk about ways to make strategic IT decisions at your organization, whether or not you're the IT person, and ways of embracing change or learning to avoid shiny object syndrome with new technology, particularly AI. But I think, SSO is another good example, and your cybersecurity of making sure you have a plan and that you're working with that plan when new bright things come in and maybe you want to do them. So you have a way to evaluate what you're putting in place. So that's going to be at 3 p.m. Eastern, noon Pacific on August 21st. So I just want to thank you, Phil and Steve, for helping us out with understanding what it even is, and then some of these considerations. And I love getting into some of the technical considerations as well. So Phil, thank you so much for joining us. And thanks everyone who spent an hour with us today. Really appreciate it. And we'll let you go on your way. Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining this Community IT Podcast Part 2. You can find Part 1 in your podcast feed if you subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Community IT does these free webinars and podcasts for our community, and we love sharing our knowledge and experience. If you have more questions or are having trouble with your IT at your nonprofit, please get in touch with us on our website, www.communityit.com, so we can start a conversation or schedule an assessment. Downloading any of our free resources there will get you signed up for our webinar reminders, and you can attend our next webinar in real time and ask our experts your own questions. If you love podcasts, please subscribe and leave us a rating to help others find this leadership resource for nonprofits.